Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving deep into something pretty complex. Non-citizen voting in the U.S. Now, you probably think, like most people, that it's just flat out illegal everywhere. End of story.
Yeah, that's the common assumption. But when we looked into the sources, what we found is actually this really tangled picture. You've got federal laws, state laws, even hyper-local rules. It's definitely not simple.
Right, not simple at all. So our mission today, we want to map out those clear legal lines,
Yeah,
citizenship and voting.
exactly. And then we need to look at these two really big opposing arguments.
Right.
One side talks about potential system weaknesses like registration loopholes and the sheer number of non-citizens. The other side argues that, well, illegal voting is actually super rare and the penalties are so high it's just not worth the risk.
And finally,
We'll actually pinpoint the maybe surprising places where non-citizens can legally vote today, and also look at this strong pushback, this movement to explicitly ban it everywhere else.
okay, let's start OJMEO, where the law seems, well, clearest. Federal elections president, Congress. If you're not a citizen, the rules seem pretty absolute there.
Oh, absolutely ironclad. There's a specific law, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. It explicitly says non-citizens voting in federal elections. That's a federal crime. No ambiguity.
And the consequences aren't trivial. We're talking serious stuff.
Really serious, life-altering, potentially. If a non-citizen illegally votes or even just registers to vote in a federal election, they're looking at hefty fines, maybe prison time up to a year.
Wow.
And, critically, immigration consequences. They can be deemed inadmissible to the U.S. or even deportable if they're already here.
That difference, inadmissible versus deportable, can you break that down a bit? Why is that distinction important?
It's crucial because it covers different situations. Inadmissible means you can't legally enter the U.S. or, say, get a green card later on. Deportable means you're already inside the U.S., maybe legally, maybe not, but the government now has grounds to physically remove you. Doing this, voting, or registering illegally flags you for both.
And I remember reading something about a separate risk, just tied to filling out the form, even without voting.
Yes, that's a really key point. When you go to register, almost everywhere, you have to check a box saying, yes, I am a U.S. citizen.
Right.
Just ticking that box falsely, claiming U.S. citizenship on that official form, that act itself is a separate reason to be found inadmissible or deportable. You don't even need to cast a ballot. Signing the form wrong is enough.
Yeah, so the federal government has this hammer, basically. Vote or register for federal office as a non-citizen and you risk deportation. But here's the twist we found, the thing that opens this whole debate. That federal law, it hammers federal elections, but it doesn't explicitly say anything about non-citizens voting in state or local elections. And that's where things get complicated.
That's precisely the gap. And, this isn't entirely new territory, historically speaking. It sounds wild to us now, but between, 1776 and 1924,
Yeah.
non-citizens were actually allowed to vote in federal, state, and local elections in something like 40 different states and territories at various times.
40. That's incredible. Why would they do that back then?
Well, it was strategic, really. Think economic development. States and territories used voting rights, non-citizen voting rights, as a way to attract people, settlers, workers, families. They needed to grow.
An incentive.
Exactly, a tool to build up the population and the economy. This was pretty common until the early 20th century. I think Arkansas was the last state to ban it for state elections back in 1926. So this idea isn't radical. It's actually kind of a throwback to an older American practice.
Okay, so history aside, because the fight now feels very current, it seems to really center on election integrity, the systems we have today.
Right.
We should probably look at both sides of this. Let's start with the concerns people raise about systemic vulnerability.
Okay. So the first point raised by groups worried about integrity is just scale, the number of non-citizens living here. Sources estimate it's around 30 million people.
30 million? Wow.
Yeah, that's nearly, 9% of the total U.S. population? So the argument starts with, that's a very large group of people potentially interacting with the registration system.
And the system itself, they argue, has holes, is leaky.
That's the claim. The main focus is often on the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, the motor voter law. Its goal was good, right?
Yeah.
Make it easier for citizens to register when they get their driver's license.
Makes sense. So how does that create a problem for non-citizens?
Well, the process emphasizes ease over proof. When you're getting your license, you're often handed the voter registration form. You just have to check the citizenship box. Under penalty of perjury, yes, but no one's asking for your birth certificate or passport right there.
Okay.
And then there's HEVIA, the Help America Vote Act. It requires ID, like a driver's license number or the last 4 digits of your social security number, but non-citizens can have those. Lawful permanent residents get them. And in almost 20 states now, even undocumented immigrants can get driver's licenses.
So the ID proves who you are, not if you're a citizen.
Exactly. It confirms identity, not citizenship status. The system is more about catching false claims later through perjury penalties, not preventing ineligible registration up front.
And this concern gets bigger when you add government outreach efforts.
That's part of the argument, too. Critics point to things like Executive Order 1.019, telling federal agencies to help with voter registration, and also the role of NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
How do they fit in?
Well, some NGOs get a lot of federal money. The sources mentioned over $1 billion recently for providing services, running shelters. The concern is, are they potentially giving voter registration forms to non-citizens? Maybe without clear instructions.
Like unintentionally?
Maybe unintentionally, maybe just following guidelines broadly. One source cited a contract in New York City where an NGO was required to give voter forms to all persons they served, which could include non-citizens.
Which brings us back to that idea of the human cost,
Yeah.
sort of victimization argument.
Yes, and this is a really concerning aspect for some observers. Imagine you're a new immigrant, maybe your English isn't perfect, an official or maybe an NGO worker hands you a form with your license application, tells you, check this box, sign here.
Right.
If you mistakenly check the citizen box, boom, instantly you've committed a crime, a deportable offense. You might have had no idea, no intention to break the law. One source used the term entrapped.
That's a heavy word. But okay, if the system is potentially this porous, are we seeing massive numbers of non-citizens actually on the voter rolls? What's the evidence?
We do see evidence of errors being caught. The numbers aren't necessarily huge compared to the total population, but they exist. For example, Virginia reported removing over 6,300 non-citizens from its rolls since 2022.
Okay, 6,300.
Texas purged about 6,500 non-citizens. And crucially, they found about 2,000 of those had actually voted in past elections. Ohio did an audit, identified nearly 600 apparent non-citizens, and found 138 had voted.
Okay, let's pause on those numbers. 6,000 here, 2,000 there who voted. If there are 30 million non-citizens, how do we interpret that? Is finding, say, 6,500 ineligible people on the rolls proof of a huge systemic failure?
Or is it proof that the checks and balances, the deterrents, are actually working reasonably well to catch the relatively few who slip through or try to cheat?
Right. That's a crux of it.
That's exactly the core conflict. The counterargument, the deterrence perspective, says it's the latter. Those numbers, while not zero, are small, and they show the system is catching errors. They argue widespread non-citizen voting just isn't plausible.
Why not plausible?
Because the risk is just too high. The act of registering, the act of voting it, creates a government record. It's evidence.
You're basically creating the proof needed to prosecute yourself.
Precisely. You're putting your name on a list that can be checked. Why would you risk, potentially, years in prison and deportation, losing everything, just to cast one vote, especially in, say, a local election? The calculation, they argue, just doesn't make sense for most people.
So it's the severity of the punishment that acts as the main deterrent, more so than the registration process itself.
That's a big part of it. Plus, there are other layers. Election officials are supposed to maintain accurate voter lists, conduct audits, and importantly, when someone applies for citizenship, the USCIS officers do investigate their voting history. Non-citizens going through that process know this check is coming.
So how does this perspective explain the instances where non-citizens are found to have voted, like those 2,000 in Texas?
They generally frame those as rare exceptions, maybe genuine mistakes, maybe people confused by officials, maybe some bad actors. But even in those cases, the consequences are severe if caught. The argument is it's not a viable strategy for widespread fraud because the risk vastly outweighs any potential reward.
Okay, so this brings us back to the listener. We've got this strict federal ban for federal elections, but no explicit federal ban for state and local.
Right.
Which means it really comes down to state and local decisions. So where is non-citizen voting actually happening right now?
As of our latest check, September 2025, it's happening in a pretty small number of places, relatively speaking. You've got the District of Columbia and then certain specific towns or cities in California, Maryland, and Vermont.
Maryland seems like a hotspot for this.
It is primarily because of its state constitution. Maryland gives its municipalities, its towns and cities, what's called home rule authority over elections. They can decide on their own voting rules without needing the state legislature to approve.
So they don't need state permission.
Correct. That's why you see more towns there doing it than anywhere else. Tacoma Park was the pioneer way back in 1993, but others have joined, like Barnesville, Frederick, Cheverly. Quite a list.
Okay, compare that to California. What's happening there?
California's approach is much narrower, much more specific. It's not about general municipal elections. Instead, non-citizen parents or legal guardians can vote only in school board elections.
Just schools.
Just schools. This is happening in San Francisco. That law survived a legal challenge, and Oakland approved it too, though it wasn't implemented right away. The logic is very targeted. Parents, regardless of citizenship, have a direct stake in their kids' schools.
Makes sense. And Vermont. Similar to Maryland.
Sort of.
Yeah.
You have towns like Montpelier, Winooski, and Burlington that now allow non-citizen voting in their local municipal elections. What's interesting in Vermont is that in some cases, the state legislature actually voted to override the governor's vetoes of these local laws.
So state-level support for local decisions there.
Yes, showing a commitment, at least in those instances, to letting the towns decide.
But just because a city passes a law doesn't mean it sticks. We saw a huge fight in New York City.
Yeah, absolutely huge. New York City passed a law in 2021. It would have allowed lawful permanent residence green card holders to vote in city elections. If it had stood, it would have been by far the largest expansion.
But it did stand.
No, it was challenged, and in March 2025, the highest state court in New York permanently blocked it. The ruling was based on the state constitution. The court said the Constitution limits voting to citizens. Full stop.
That feels like a major precedent. How does a state constitutional ruling like that impact other places?
It provides a very clear legal blueprint for opponents. If your state constitution explicitly uses the word citizen when defining who can vote, even for local elections, then any local law trying to expand suffrage to non-citizens is likely vulnerable to being struck down. It suggests you'd need to amend the state constitution first, which is a much higher bar.
Interesting. But then you have Washington, D.C., where their law did survive a challenge.
Right. D.C.'s Non-Citizen Vote Act took effect in 2023, letting non-citizens vote in local D.C. elections. It was challenged, but a court dismissed the lawsuit in early 2024.
Why was that outcome different?
The court's reasoning was interesting. It basically said the plaintiffs, who were citizen voters, couldn't show they were actually harmed, their votes weren't being diluted or treated differently just because non-citizens could also vote in those local races. It wasn't a ruling on the fundamental legality under, say, a state constitution, because D.C. isn't a state.
Okay, so we have these pockets of local expansion, some surviving, some getting struck down. But what's the bigger trend here?
Well, if you step back and look at the national picture, despite those local examples, the dominant trend lately is actually moving strongly against non-citizen voting, a very organized pushback.
And that pushback isn't just lawsuits, it's changing state constitutions.
Exactly. That's been the main strategy since around 2018. States have proactively started adding language directly into their constitutions saying only U.S. citizens can vote in state and local elections, explicitly banning it.
How many states have done that now?
As of September 2025, the count was up to 17 states with that explicit constitutional ban.
And when these constitutional amendments go to the voters on the ballot, how do they fare?
Overwhelmingly popular, it seems. The sources pointed out that between 2018 and 2024, every single time, 14 out of 14 times a ballot measure like this was put to voters, it passed. States across the map, North Dakota, Colorado, Florida, Ohio, Louisiana, all approved these citizenship requirements. 0 rejections by voters.
That's a pretty clear signal from voters in those states. Is Congress getting involved too? Trying to influence this from the federal level?
Yes, there's federal pressure building as well. There's a proposed bill, the No Vote for Non-Citizens Act. Its approach is financial leverage.
How so?
It proposes cutting federal funding by a significant 30% for any state or locality that allows non-citizens to vote in any election, even local ones. It would also force them to use separate ballots and voter rolls.
Wow. So the feds are trying to discourage local non-citizen voting by hitting their budgets.
That's the idea. It's an attempt to use federal power to enforce a uniform citizenship standard, even where local governments might want otherwise.
Okay. So wrapping this up, we've seen this really stark contrast today. On one hand, you have this small but diverse group of towns and cities saying, hey, local residents, even non-citizens, should have a say in local issues.
Right, places like Tacoma Park, San Francisco School Boards, D.C.
And on the other hand, you have this solid federal ban for federal elections, backed up by this wave of state constitutional amendments explicitly prohibiting non-citizen voting at any level.
It really highlights this deep tension, doesn't it, between different ideas of belonging and participation. Historically, as we said, voting rights were sometimes used very practically to encourage settlement and growth.
Yeah, the economic incentive argument.
And today's advocates for local non-citizen voting echo that a bit, but focus on local investment. They say non-citizens pay local taxes, use local services like schools and garbage collection. They live in the community. So why shouldn't they have a voice in how those local services are run?
It does raise a provocative final thought.
It does. If that 19th century approach, using voting rights to attract people, actually worked, does the fact that we're seeing non-citizen voting reemerge today, even if it's legally contested, tell us something? Does it suggest that maybe in areas with high migration, the sense of local political community is evolving faster than our national legal definitions of citizenship and voting rights?
Like the reality on the ground is outpacing the legal framework.
Possibly. This clash between the political identity of a place at the city, the community, and the legal identity of the citizen, that's a fundamental challenge, especially for democracies like the U.S. dealing with significant migration. Who gets to participate and at what level? It's a question we're clearly still wrestling with.